Hello and welcome to another edition of Protect and Educate. I'm your host, Marco Johnson. Thanks for joining us. It's here, another school year is just around the corner. Top of mind, school supplies, classes, and clothes, of course. But we also want to talk about safety. That's why we're joined by Officer Pete Scott of the KCK Police Department. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
So before we get into safety, you and I were chatting beforehand, and you are also a coach?
Correct.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this year will be my first year on staff as the assistant baseball coach at Washington. First time I've coached in the district, actually, but I've coached in the Kansas City area 4 different sports for the last 15 to 20 years, off and on. I got 6 kids, and at various points they've all chose different sports, so I got to hop around.
I got you. That's excellent.
Yeah.
So let's just dive into the safety. You know, a lot of these folks are going to be coming to school and they're going to be driving. So what are some tips you want to suggest for those kids who will be behind the wheel as they come to school?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, top of the list is always, as it's always been, seatbelt safety. We run a program called SAFE in USD 500 high schools, and that stands for Seatbelts Are For Everyone. It's a campaign that runs for 2-3 months, maybe longer than that, throughout the school year. And what we do is we build safe teams. It'll be like 5 to 10 students, and they'll conduct seatbelt surveys upon entry in the morning and dismissal in the afternoon. And they'll just kind of take count of how many people are wearing a seatbelt, is the driver wearing a seatbelt, is the passenger wearing a seatbelt. And then we turn those stats over to the state of Kansas. They do this all over the state of Kansas. So while we're doing that, obviously raises awareness just that we're talking about it. We also create incentives for wearing your seatbelt at the same time while we're running the campaign. So, for instance, we'll get kids to sign a pledge that they'll wear their seatbelt, and then we'll put those names in a raffle type system, and we'll pull a name out every month, and they'll get a gift card. So that just kind of raises awareness.
Absolutely. So
safety.
It's an incentive.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
And I've noticed that the kids actually stick to it too. I try to pay attention, especially the kids I know, like, hey, are you wearing your seatbelt? And they stick to it pretty well. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, a lot of us are guilty of this, driving while texting. Do you ever approach that subject at all with students?
Yes, I do. So I approach that. So about 1.5 years ago, to put it in short, I happened upon, not on duty, 2 young children in Independence who had been in an accident. The passenger was not wearing a seatbelt, and her brother in the driver's side was texting when they were hit by an oncoming bus. Now, luckily, thank God, they were all right, and I followed up with them over the months to come. But I kind of used that story as an example of how it could happen to any kid, and how those kids were extraordinarily lucky that it turned out the way it did, because it could have been a lot worse.
Seatbelts and texting and driving, those are, I think, the 2 tenets that we really need to push, just not only for young folks, but for adults as well.
Agreed.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's also talk about social media. Again, kids these age, that's all they're into for the most part. So what are the tips you might have for them? So
we deal with social media a lot, as you can imagine. It perpetuates a lot of problems. It instigates a lot of problems. So we have a handout. Officer Sanoha used to be at Washington, got a hold of these little books called Social Media Awareness, and half the book's for the parents and half the book's for the student. So while I won't refer to that like every time I'm in the heat of a discussion with a student about social media, it's a great reference point, and it also gives you a chance to kind of get the parents and the kids involved, because a lot of times the problems that we have on social media is that the parents aren't aware. And I mean, I myself, being my age, this wasn't my time, it's easy to do, right?
Absolutely.
Because it wasn't the first thing on our minds at that age. So I think collectively raising awareness, and if you can get involved with parents and kids, and then protecting kids in a couple different ways when it comes to social media. Obviously, there's a lot of fears there with people misrepresenting themselves, adults communicating with children, but also even just the day-to-day things, like how blown out of proportion something can become. by discussing it on social media. So I try to encourage the kids when we have a problem to, put that phone, or I'll even discuss with parents like, hey, put the phone away tonight. Don't go home and have this out on social media.
So you're saying things will escalate?
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely, on social media. Because, so back in our day, not to make us sound old, but you would have an argument at school and go home and it wasn't right there in your face. And natural human instinct is if you're away from a conflict, it just naturally cools, right? Your emotions settle down. You become a little bit more aware of how you're acting. That's really hard nowadays with kids because they go home and that same person is still right there. And we can do it all night long, right? And then we just walk back into the school tomorrow and pick up where we left off, basically.
That's interesting that you brought that up because, again, in my mind, I'm walking away from it, but then they're right there because their phone never leaves their hand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're always connected. Or they always have the potential to be connected, I guess is what I'm saying.
So again, monitoring is the key right there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of just teaching kids to monitor themselves at the same time and showing them the natural negative consequences of not monitoring themselves,
Good point. We're going to have a rush of kids coming to school soon. What are some tips you might have for those folks who are entering the building to keep the building safe?
Yeah, so that's a big one. We have spent a lot of time on this. We've had Officer Binion and Officer Dunphy checking all the reinforcements on doors, like what locks are faulty, making sure key cards work properly. That's been a pretty big initiative, I think, from the top of our department with Chief. That obviously everything's happened in the last year. We're definitely way more mindful of it. We're monitoring door entries. I also, I tried to have a short meeting with my Washington staff and incoming teachers to kind of raise awareness and like, hey, don't prop that door open if you're bringing supplies in out of your car, because they might not think about it. They've got a busy job. It's a hurried day, and the tendency is you don't want to get your key card back out, or you don't want to pull your old manual key out. But the risk of not doing so at the wrong time is definitely, worth getting that key out or that key.
We are living in a time where that needs to be top of mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the theme will always be like raising awareness. A lot of these things are just about raising awareness, because if you keep it in people's minds, then it becomes a habit. It becomes commonplace. And if we could keep doing that, I think that everybody will be a lot safer.
So everyone's ramping up for the new school year. So how about your department? You guys have just been doing what these past few months?
Oh man, so it's been a lot of training. We participated in multiple training. One of the great trainings we had just a few weeks ago was a CIT youth course. It's like crisis intervention.
Okay.
It's how to intervene in crises specifically with youth. I thought that was a great course. A lot of our new officers were made to think about things that maybe you don't think about coming in, you know what I mean? They haven't dealt with youth forever.
And that's the beauty of training.
Absolutely, absolutely. You always, sometimes you drag your feet going into training, but when you get there, it's always like, oh man, I'm glad I did this. At least I'm speaking for myself. At the end, I always feel better, and I feel like I'm going back at my job with a renewed sense of confidence. Yeah. As
we wrap this up, is there anything you'd like parents and students to know as the new year starts?
I think my biggest thing would be, parents, just stay connected with your kids. Going back to the social media thing, I know life gets busy. You got two parents working, you got one parent working two jobs, whatever it might be. A lot of times we can just kind of go autopilot, and kids need more connection than that. You know what I mean? They need constant involvement. And I think a lot of times in modern society we forget that. And it is because they're distracted with media, and we kind of like, well, he seemed okay, but you really have to connect with your kids constantly, be it about school or sports or even their friend group or whatever thing that you think is silly that, they might like. If it's important to them, it's important to you. I think that's the best thing to do in our community.
I totally agree. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah,
Officer
absolutely.
Scott, I appreciate you coming by and talking to us. Great information, and hopefully someone will hear it and absorb it. So thank you for coming out.
Thank you
and
for
thank you for coming out and listening and watching to another edition of Protect and Educate.